Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about the immediate after effects of the war, and we're actually going to begin with an event that occurs before the war is even over that I've kind of alluded to. So take a look at the before and after, like we were looking at, of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. This is how everything starts with the British colonies, the 13 American colonies. Here's the French in the yellow. And then once the war is over, we see that Canada in the Treaty of Paris in 1763 is ceded to the British. That's why in Canada, they call this war the War of Conquest. Remember, Florida was given to the British at the end of this war in the treaty in exchange because the British, during the course of the 7 Years' War, had captured Cuba and the Philippines. So Britain agrees to give back those colonies to Spain in exchange for Florida, which was probably less valuable, honestly, because the lack of, as many sugar plantations as they had like on Cuba. But strategically very important for the British, as was Canada. Because remember, Canada also was, given it to the British in exchange for the British giving back to France some of these tiny French islands in the Caribbean. It's all about sugar. But strategically, the British come out huge. And of course, the big thing for most colonists was that everything to the east of the Mississippi River, here's the Mississippi River right here, everything to the east of it was now British. And so remember, this had all started because of many colonists, many land speculators, like the Ohio Company in Virginia, men like George Washington that were part of it, wanting to get that very valuable Ohio River Valley land. And remember, this all started here in Western Pennsylvania in that region. So now the colonists, by 1760, most of the fighting was done. They'd captured Quebec. They eventually captured Montreal. So by this point, a lot of the colonists are like, yippee, we've done it. And they're very eager to start moving inland, westward, across the Appalachian Mountains, which are this older mountain range here in our East Coast, and then into this new valuable fertile land of the Ohio River Valley. And that is what's happening before the peace treaty is even signed. So like from 1760 to 1763, a lot of those roads that were made by the military, by groups like Braddock's army, before like the Battle of Monongahela, of course. But a lot of these roads and these forts that were built because of the war for the British soldiers and the colonial soldiers become routes that the colonists use to migrate westward. Now, of course, who does this upset? Who does this anger? Who does this betray? Because they'd had a treaty agreeing that they would side with the British in exchange for this not to happen. Your answer? It should be the Native Americans. So that leads us to Pontiac's Rebellion, which actually takes place before the French and Indian War, before the 7 Years' War is even over in 1763. And it's named after Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa Nation. But actually, it begins with a Delaware religious leader in Pennsylvania there known as Neolin. And this is not going to be the first of these Native American prophets that we hear saying a similar message. This will not be the last, sorry. But basically, Neolin is telling fellow Native Americans about pan-Indianism. That basically, hey, instead of being, the Ottawa or the Shawnee or the Mingo or the Mohawk, we should be, just one people. We'll be stronger if we unify instead of having all these different tribal nations. Let's come together. And in this message, he's saying, let's reject the European commercial, way of doing business. Let's go back to our roots. Let's forsake these Western, clothing and go back to our native pelts and paints and feathers. He's saying especially reject alcohol. He preaches that alcohol was something that was destroying Native American culture, and he was probably right about that. And forsake Native American technology. Go back to our Native American roots, unify, kick out these invaders. But if there's some French guys, they're okay. But they were very, very worried about the British, and many Native Americans saw the writing on the wall before this was even over, when the French lost, and this was very troubling for them because for so long they had been playing these different European powers off one another, right? So as long as it's like a little kid playing mom and dad off each other, like they spill something or they steal a cookie, and and they blame it on the dog, and they tell mom one thing and they tell dad the other, and they know that mom's a softie, and that, or like, mommy, daddy said I could. Oh, dad said you could. Let me have a word with dad, and that kind of stuff. Anyway, you get the idea. They were playing the British and the French off each other. Well, at the end of the French and Indian War, excuse me, what happens is that the French are no longer going to really be there in any major presence for the Indians, the Native Americans, to play off the two powers. Now it's just the British that they're dealing with. And think of the settlements of pattern that we've been discussing since, colonization began. The French were much more amiable, trading status with the natives, much more friendly. They came in smaller numbers. They often did not settle or come in family groups most of the time, especially out on the western frontier. The British were the exact opposite, right? They came in families, they came in large numbers, they came to settle and to take the land. They're less interested in trading, although they are trading, and that is all happening. Another thing that's going to so natives are very worried about the British coming into this land. You have lots of settlers before the treaty is even signed, right? Like I said, many settlers are starting to pour into this land. There was the Treaty of Easton, where the Iroquois League, the big, powerful New England tribe of 5 different nations, they had signed that with the English, agreeing to ally with them officially, in exchange for the British not to go and settle this land. And here these settlers are breaking the word of the British. So that was a big problem. Another thing I want to bring up is gift giving. Now, in Native culture, gift giving was not just, a nice gesture, or a bribe. It was also a ritualistic thing meant to kind of affirm ties of friendship between different groups. I give you a gift, I am your friend. Okay, gift giving was more than just, here's this nice thing, pay me in exchange or something like that. And the British and the French, they had been giving more and more gifts, being more and more generous, in the lead up to and during the French and Indian War. How come? Because they need native allies, because it's the French and Indian War. They're using their native allies to try to get the edge over the other empire. Well, what do you think the British are going to do once the war is over? Are they going to keep giving the Native Americans those rewards, those gifts? No, they stop allotting all this money for gift giving. And this, of course, this isn't just, oh, we're not getting our presents. This is very, this is a big affront to the Native Americans. It also makes them think that the ties, the official alliance that they built with these gifts was over, that the British were now plotting against them. And so that's another thing that's happening here, making the Native Americans extremely nervous about the situation. And so that's why you had several different chieftains, including Pontiac, kind of hearing Naolin's message, this Indian prophet's message, and basically leading this rebellion, which will be popularly known as Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. They attacked dozens of forts in the Ohio River Valley and even northward. Fort Detroit, one of the big western forts at the time there in Michigan, was besieged. They take a whole bunch of forts in some very dubious ways. This was some ugly frontier fighting. Um, as these forts were taken by the British and garrisoned by the British, you'd have trading outpost villages and towns and homes rise up around the fort to help supply the fort. And these people were not behind the fort's walls, so they were unprotected. So oftentimes the Native Americans would use them as hostages to try to force the British soldiers that were inside the forts. You could see Here's the fort walls and stuff. Here's the fort walls. They would use these Native American, sorry, they would use these British colonists, these citizens who were in these trading villages around the forts. They'd use them as hostages, and put them in front of the fort's walls where the soldiers on the parapets could see them, and they would slit their throats, disembowel them, threaten to kill the ladies in front of them, children. And then they did if the British didn't open their doors. And when the British did open their doors, then they ransacked and massacred everyone that was inside. There were even several instances of the British capitulating, surrendering, and being promised safe passage out of there by the Native Americans, that they would not be harmed. And of course, as soon as they opened the fort gates, everyone was killed. So surrendering doesn't do you any good. The Native Americans, what they're doing here is being terrorists. And I mean, it's ugly on both sides. We'll talk about the Paxton boys briefly as well. Yeah. Oh, but yeah, they're not sparing anything here, because they need these British gone. They need them to not expand. Remember, many of these tribes are already desperate because they'd already been for the last several generations pushed off their land. And so this is where they are taking a stand. Um, so there's a very famous incident at Fort Mickleback, in this region as this is going on, where the Native Americans, as was kind of common for the time, were playing an early game of Native American ball and net, kind of similar to what will become lacrosse. It's kind of like hockey, but on grass. To give you an idea, if you don't know what lacrosse is. And they're doing this outside the fort's walls. And many of the British soldiers, when the Native Americans would play their game of lacrosse, they would come out and watch the natives play. It was like sport, and take bets and everything. And Native American women would be there on the fort walls watching, kind of in their beautiful, ornate poncho type dresses that are very, kind of big and billowy, and are perfect to hide like weapons, like firearms. And so, as the natives' game is progressing, one of the Native American lacrosse players, he shoots the ball over the fort's walls. Wouldn't you know it? You're playing a game of soccer or something, you kick the ball over a fence or whatever have you. Happens all the time, right? And so what do? You got to cross the fence and go get the ball. So the Native Americans, they rush into the fort. Again, nothing strange happening, right? This happens all the time. And as they're rushing into the fort to go get their ball, the Native American women throw open their ponchos and toss them these weapons, these firearms. And that's how they stormed the fort, and they killed every British person they could find, leaving many of there were several Frenchmen that were inside unharmed. So that was Fort Mickleback. Another famous instance while these forts are under attack was Fort Pitt. Now remember, this was a big fort, very important strategically anyway, during the French and Indian War. Originally called Fort Duquesne, at the forks of the Ohio River there. The Allegheny and Monongahela rivers split off from the Ohio River. And at Fort Pitt, named after the Secretary of State that had been so helpful to the colonists, William Pitt, the Native Americans are besieging the fort, and they have several of the British civilian hostages outside that they kill in front of the British soldiers. But the British soldiers, they stay firm. They refuse to open their gates, because they've already gotten word that if they surrender, their lives are forfeit anyway. They'll die anyway, right? So they stay in their fort knowing they have enough supplies to kind of outlast a siege. Because if you think about it, Native Americans, they're not built for siege warfare. They do much better, in the scoot and shoot, the guerrilla warfare style that we talk so much about at Monongahela. That's where they thrive. A siege warfare, it has to be planned. It's all about logistics. You have to have a lot of time. For Native Americans, they're not professional soldiers like you'd see in the French army or the British army. These men are oftentimes necessary for the harvest. They can't be doing a siege, sitting outside a fort twiddling their thumbs for all that time, because they don't have the food supply to do that. So the British kind of felt comfortable knowing that they could outlast the natives. And that's sort of what happens. But in the process, they agree to a quick parlay. Remember the gift giving idea? And they do exchange some gifts to try to maybe see if they could get the natives to back off. Well, also very nastily, the British had included in these gifts that they gave to the Native Americans besieging their fort, they had given a blanket that was riddled with smallpox. It had smallpox pus, like, oozed all over it. And this smallpox blanket, I mean, that's an example of biological warfare, shows you the length that the British were willing to go to. I mean, not that, again, you got to think, you got to see history in the context of the time. These people are outside your fort ready to kill you. You've just witnessed them kill innocent women and children in front of your eyes. It's that kind of puts into context. Well, at the same time, I mean, the Native Americans were fighting for their lives, their homes, their land. But yeah, they get smallpox, and it's not known whether this instance of spread of smallpox will be carried west. There are already several other points where smallpox at this time is going to be transferred very far inland west, more so than it ever had been before, and devastate many of those Native American populations that otherwise probably would have aided the French during this whole episode. So yeah, biological warfare. This was an ugly thing that happened, Pontiac's rebellion. But eventually, what happens is that they are able to wear down the Native American resolve. These sieges on these last few big forts, like Fort Pitt, um, do not result in the British opening their gates. The British are able to maintain those forts, and eventually the Native Americans disperse and go home because they have to. And that's the end of Pontiac's rebellion. Now, what did the Native Americans want? They wanted for that border to be affirmed by the British that had been promised in the Treaty of Easton. They wanted no more British settlers to go west. They wanted them to stay on their side of the mountains. That was the goal here. In western Pennsylvania, in a town called Paxton, there were some British settlers, some colonists, who decided to take matters into their own hands. Recall the colony of Pennsylvania. Remember, founded by William Penn. He was what, Faith? He was a Quaker. Remember the oatmeal? Yeah. And so William Penn, he believed in a colony of friendship and unity with the Native Americans where everybody could exist in peace and equality. That was why the Quakers, they'd invented the handshake. It was more a sign of greeting of equals rather than like bowing in deference or curtsying to your betters. But anyway, the grand experiment of Penn's colony is going to kind of come to an end here. Because the skirmishes and the ugly warfare happening against the natives and the French in Western Pennsylvania, and what the Paxton Boys do eventually kind of forces a lot of the Quakers still in the Pennsylvania Assembly to resign. Benjamin Franklin is all mixed up in this as well at this time, or he was a Quaker part of this. But the Paxton Boys, they are sick of the British government not sending any reinforcements, any assistance to protect their towns and villages that are being ransacked by Native American attacks. And so they gather men, pitchforks, muskets, whatever, everything you can name there, and they go and raid Native American praying villages. Remember, praying Indians, praying towns, these were Native Americans that had converted to Christianity and agreed to kind of assimilate and be peaceful with the Europeans, with the British. And here come the Paxton Boys, and they slaughter a village. They kill like half a dozen men, women, children. And many other Native Americans from these praying villages there in Western Pennsylvania, they flee east. They go all the way to Philadelphia to seek refuge at the colony's capital. And Benjamin Franklin himself actually will go out from Philadelphia when the Paxton Boys arrive to come and kill these natives that are seeking refuge there. And he will kind of bargain with and entreats the Paxton Boys to go home, and eventually gets them to leave and saves these Native Americans who were, their lives were at risk. But again, terrible things on both sides. And what's eventually going to happen is that you see the tensions building here. It's not just the case that everybody's happy at the end of the French and Indian War. Division lines are forming. You see with the Paxton Boys, the division between those in the rural country places like the Western frontiers are living very, very different lives from those people on the East Coast who are more protected by the British soldiers, the British government. They're more entrenched, British trade right there on the coast. People on the frontier are scared and they feel alone and they feel like the British government has left them. And you also see the divide here in a similar way between the rich and the poor. Again, those people living on the coast seem to be much more prosperous, much richer than those people on the frontier who are poor, often backwoods farmers. And they start to see, you start to see a lot of resentment among those people against the British crown, even at this time when, British patriotism was running very, very high at the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. They say colonists were never more proud to be British than at this moment in 1763, but that was probably talking about East Coast colonists, not about frontier woodsman colonists. So the British reaction to this, and remember, this is the new king who had just taken over, and it was coronated in 1760 during the war. That's King George III. He will issue this Proclamation Act of 1763, which creates the proclamation line you see on this map. And it basically says to the colonists, you cannot go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this wasn't just because the British government wanted to keep its word to the Native Americans, like to the Iroquois from the Treaty of Easton. It's partly that, so good on the British for keeping their word, and that helps out the Native Americans. But it was also because the British are seriously, seriously in debt. Okay, they spent the equivalent today of tens of trillions of dollars in today's money on the 7 Years' War. Because remember, they weren't just fighting in North America, sending thousands of British soldiers. They were fighting in the Philippines. They were fighting in India. They were fighting all over the world, especially in Europe. And so they're tens of trillions of dollars in debt, and they don't have the money or the willpower to be sending more British soldiers out to the American frontier to go and protect colonists at this time. So that was another big impetus for this proclamation line in 1763. The reaction from the colonists, very upset. Even George Washington, who remember had fought as a British soldier, who had wanted to be commissioned as a British officer, although he was not able to be, was very upset by this and is illegally going to tell his speculators to go out and buy as much land in this Ohio country as they possibly could with his money. But of course, keep it on the down low because all of those purchases would be illegal because of this act. But there's lots of speculators who are going to break this law and go out into this land anyway and purchase land from natives. There's lots of settlers who are going to be going west on those trails formed by the war, and they're going to be settling this land illegally. They by and large kind of ignore this proclamation line, and it does nothing but really anger a lot of colonists because they felt like, well, this is what the war was about. How dare you tell us that, everything we sacrificed for, we're not going to be allowed to get now that we've won. So that's the proclamation line of 1763. Like I said, a lot of historians claim that, the colonists, they were never more proud to be British than at the end of the French and Indian War. It was a great victory of the British over the French. Um, However, you see the lines in the sand forming, like we talked about, between rich and poor, rural and urban, talking about those lines between those colonists on the East Coast and those on the frontier. But you also saw the British kind of looking down on many of the colonial troops. Men like George Washington and Daniel Morgan and Charles Lee and others who fought in battles like Monongahela during the French and Indian War, they were seen as less of a soldier, less in rank than the British. They were seen as a joke basically by the British military, the colonial troops. And remember, they were often not given much in the way of responsibilities. And there had also been many colonists, like we talked about, them breaking the Proclamation Act and going west and settling that land west of the Appalachian Mountains anyway. During the war itself, during the height of the war, many colonists didn't care that we were at war with the French, and they continued to do trade with them, or even started to do trade with the French because it was so lucrative. Um, they didn't care that it was illegal. They were smuggling and other things. You see less respect towards the British Crown. And again, most people at this time, if you were born in the colonies, you maybe your family had been there for generations, you're starting to identify with your colony more than with the British Empire. All right, so here we see the state of things. 1763, this is the Proclamation Line. This is the British land that is east of the Mississippi River. This is all of Canada that's been ceded to the British. The 13 original colonies includes that area of Acadia, Nova Scotia, eventually be part of Canada today. There's Spanish Florida, now part of the British Empire. We didn't talk about it, but remember in this lecture, but remember that the Louisiana Purchase land, the great interior, the Louisiana Territory, that was French. And in the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1762, 1763, right before the Treaty of Paris, the French actually will sell to the Spanish, they'll trade to the Spanish, the Louisiana Territory. And so that's why that is Spanish land. But then right before Jefferson buys it from Napoleon in 1803, the French get it back. So more on that later. Here's a little bit of a closer view, and you can see this Ohio region here. This is beyond that proclamation line. This is what we're talking about. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end there, but I just want to give you a quick preview for what's coming, because we are now in revolutionary mode. Everything we're talking about is now leading to the American Revolution. So think about the impact of the French and Indian War on the American Revolution. Why do we often see it as the starting point? It's because of that massive debt. Remember, tens of trillions of dollars the British spent. And as a way to raise revenue, of course, the British government is going to levy a lot of taxes on the colonists. But not just that, they're going to actually start to, and this is the key part, enforce the navigation acts that for so long had been lax. Remember this theory of salutary neglect from like the 1600s, that the colonies exist for the benefit of the mother country, mercantilism, that's a given. But just the fact that the colonies were successful and doing well, that also benefited the mother country. And so Britain had other fish to fry, so to speak. They largely left the colonies to their own devices. And that was that neglect. They didn't really enforce the laws and the taxes that were in the books. And the colonists were rampantly smuggling and doing trade with the Dutch and the Spanish and the French behind Britain's back. And Britain didn't really, enforce anything or care. That is not going to be the case after the French and Indian War. The British are going to start to enforce their taxes. They are start to basically cut down on the smuggling. And that's really what's going to anger a lot of these colonists. But think about it, which colonists are angered by this? Those backwood farmers we just talked about, like the Paxton boys, those Scotch-Irish guys who got really upset with the Native Americans, took matters, as vigilantes into their own hands and slaughtered innocent praying Indians. They're not the ones that are going to be majorly hurt by Britain enforcing, these navigation acts, these taxes and other things to repay their war debt. It's going to be the coastal, urban colonists, the commercial merchants, the merchant class, guys like John Hancock in Boston. They're going to be the ones that are hurt. They're going to be the ones who are going to be angered. They're going to be the ones who are going to start to stir the fire and print papers against this and build up a case against the British and kind of get these others, like those backwood farmers, on their side. One last thing, food for thought. I think it's very interesting. During all of these cries, we're going to hear of no taxation without representation. that will be the rallying cry of the colonists against the tyrannical British government that is so taxing on them. Um, Keep in mind that there were many, 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 many citizens of the British Empire that paid taxes and had no representation in Parliament in London. Even citizens in England itself, people who lived in English cities like Birmingham and Manchester, big English cities, and I'm talking, white men in those cities could not vote. The British government, many members of the British Parliament, they felt that they had a right to rule and tax and do as they pleased for the entire empire under what they called virtual representation. The idea that they didn't just represent the little province or area that they were elected from, they were, as members of parliament, representing all of the empire, including the colonies in India and in the Caribbean and in Canada and in North America's East Coast 13 original colonies. All right, with that said, we will get on the War for Independence more next time. Thank you guys very much. I'll talk to you later. Bye.